Hi, I'm Tony for ExecuNet. Thanks as always for tuning in. Blacks in corporate America are largely invisible. Beyond tweets and hashtags, what are some actions organizations can and must take to achieve justice, equality, and reform? Joining me to talk about this supremely important subject is CEO at HR executive and industrial search firm GattiHR, Mr. Tom Connolly. Tom, it's good to be talking to you.
Tony, it's a pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
My pleasure. Well, Tom, we've all seen the numbers. Just about 3% of senior leaders at American companies are Black, and there are only 4 or so Black CEOs leading Fortune 500 companies. Why do Black Americans remain scarce in executive suites?
Look, I think it's time for us to recognize that just taking the position that if everyone plays by the same rules, that it is a level playing field, and that if everyone comes up through the same experiences and brings the same qualifications to the table, that they are indeed being given the same shot at these opportunities. And the reality is that they're not. And it's not just about life experiences. It's also about ways of operating, ways that people are trained, and the way that they think. And it's also about the environment that envelops them. There is a supportive, almost assumptive environment that happens if you're brought through the system with the right pedigree, the right schools, the right friends. Those are all realities. And I think for a long time we have just ignored those as realities that create an unlevel playing field, and that corporations are not the better for it, because they're missing out on the kinds of perspectives that would help them compete better, understand the world better, and appeal to a customer base that they may not even be thinking about.
Mm-hmm. There's a major difference in my mind, Tom, between diversity and inclusiveness. And what we're experiencing firsthand now is that people want not only to be in the room and to be seen and at the table, but also contribute to the decision-making process. How can we create more inclusiveness across the organization?
I think that's a fundamental place where everybody is presuming that merely composing a diverse team creates a diverse environment, and the kind of multicultural competency that's necessary for people to truly be able to work together, and for everyone to be able to respect and understand one another's perspective and take the best from those, is something that we just have to learn. I mean, even as Caucasians, we have to recognize that sometimes we're not even nice to each other. And when you get into an environment where the filter through which that rough and tumble, what we consider perhaps competitive play. I spent a lot of time on Wall Street, and it was almost a game to loudly argue with each other and call one another names and then go have a beer. But when that kind of behavior is filtered through another life lens, it creates a situation where things that are accepted perhaps become microaggressions, and that we're not competent in understanding what the consequences of those are to others' participation. So I think it's not sufficient for us to just compose diverse teams. We have to give the right kind of training, education, orientation to everyone on that team about what it means to be truly inclusive. And I think that's where a lot of companies are falling short.
Yes. So let's talk about some of the near and long-term steps that CEOs and boards need to take to create more diverse top leadership.
Yeah, I think part of it is it can no longer be something that just happens, and we can no longer have as an excuse that there's not a big enough applicant pool. If we have to create that applicant pool, then let's create it. There has to be a proactive level of outreach to make sure that people understand that they're truly welcome. That can't start, though, by making sure that there are, X number of women on the board and X number of Black senior executives, and then making sure that they're in positions like HR or another staff position where it's very visible that we've put someone who checks all the boxes in. We need to see those folks in positions that are truly, not just about the kind of staff functions that they're talking about. They have to be in operating roles. And if they're not ready, we have to get them ready. And I think we have to recognize that at the end of the day, if we can't find candidates that are good enough for those roles in communities of color, then we've got to create them. It is on us to recognize that the education system, for example, is funded quite differentially depending on where you grow up and what your zip code is. If the consequence of that is that we don't have enough people coming from communities of color to be able to compete effectively, then we've got to give them those skills. And the fact that the public education system may have failed them early on because of the way it's structured, corporations can have a tremendous impact on fixing that problem and fixing it quickly. And it's something that with the right resources, and I actually don't believe that there aren't enough resources, which is always the argument that you get for this, that we don't have time or we don't have the resources to train people. We do have that. And I think companies need to step up and begin to understand that that is part of their responsibility if they want to be a corporate member of a community.
Mm-hmm. Tom, have you seen mentoring programs that are effective in this way implemented in organizations? Can you talk to me a bit about what an ideal mentoring program needs to be and accomplish?
Well, I think there are different models that work. I think traditional bilateral mentoring without a beginning, a middle, and an end doesn't work well. It needs to be well structured. I think there are larger programmatic initiatives that companies can support, like the Posse Foundation as an example, that takes very high potential students and puts them in environments that they otherwise wouldn't have had access to, but also recognizes that you can't drop someone in out of a disadvantaged environment into a very privileged one alone and expect them to be able to operate effectively. So that things like the Posse Foundation have an ability to pull people together and put them in as a group, and it has extraordinarily good outcomes educationally and professionally. I think there are things like that that companies can support that that run the gamut of mentoring programs and different ways of doing it. I don't think there's one best way to do it, but there are lots of options on how companies can contribute to solutions to that problem.
Finally, Tom, tell me about one or two things that people within organizations need to model, behavior they should model so that others around them act accordingly and our outcome is achieved.
There are so many things that we could do to do this better. If I were to focus on just two, I would have two suggestions. Mm-hmm. One is it is no longer sufficient to be quietly non-racist. We have to be loudly anti-racist. And that means that when we see behavior that in the past we may have just let go, or in the past we may have minimized the importance of in being exclusionary, we got to call people out on it. And I think the first thing that we have to do is kind of recognize that that is everyone's responsibility. And we can't hide behind the veil of, well, that's not politically correct, or that we're now going down a politically correct slippery slope. We have to do those things. Second, I think we have to understand that we're redefining the definition of ideal candidate. So, at our firm, our largest business is executive search. And when executive search is simplified down to a resume and a pedigree, then it is a pretty straightforward task. I think one of the things that I'm excited about with this is it now widens the definition of what it means to be a potentially successful executive. And we have to balance many more things now, many more performance and potential dimensions in trying to imagine that particular candidate, whether it's a candidate of color or otherwise, in that particular role. And we have to be much more multidimensional in the way we think about the ideal candidate for that role. So I'm very excited to be able to talk to my clients about that being the challenge now, not to tick boxes and not to find more round pegs for round holes, but to really dimensionalize the job and imagine what it could take to put somebody who could be truly successful and impactful into a role.
Wonderful. Tom Connolly of GattiHR, thank you very much for making time and sharing your insights today.
Tony, this was great. Thanks a lot.